Welcome to First Class Fantasy. I'm Theo Gremminger. I'm joined as always by the one and only Billy Muzio. Billy dropped a massive rankings update. I was happy to be part of his little, I don't know, like we had like a little collective. I was giving my opinions, but Billy definitely steered the ship on that one. We're going to talk about that a little bit later, but I'm really excited to welcome in a first-time guest to First Class Fantasy, and that's Greg Brainos. And you know Greg Brainos, if you're following fantasy football right now, especially if you're on Twitter, one of the coolest Twitter follows there is the CoachSpeak Index. That is Greg's Twitter account. And Greg has put together a really awesome tool for fantasy managers where you've created this sort of amazing tool where you're not only providing clips anytime a coach says anything fantasy relevant, you're also sharing your own opinions. You're also kind of diving into camp news, but you've tracked whether these guys are honest or liars. And I always kind of assume they're all liars, but you have some guys you kind of trust a little bit more than others. So, Greg, welcome to First Class Fantasy. Let everybody know kind of like how you came about with the CoachSpeak Index.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for the invite. Glad to be here. And I've been playing fantasy football for 20 years, and CoachSpeak has, in my opinion, been the number one problem for fantasy as long as I can remember. And I'm kind of surprised no one has created a tool up to the point of a couple of years ago when I did. And the breaking point for me was Zach Taylor in 2020 talking about Joe Mixon, called him day to day. It's just a little foot issue. Might not play this week, but he'll be back soon. And that was mid to late October. Mixon didn't play a game for the rest of the season. And the Zach Taylor kept this charade going of, well, maybe next week. And we heard maybe next week for months. So that was kind of the breaking point for me. I thought, all right, I got to fix this problem. The more we can take the guesswork out of fantasy, the bigger edge that we're going to get. And realizing that hindsight is 2020, I can just go back, look at their press conferences and transcripts and, look at everything that they've said and log it in a database and see how honest these guys really are. Because there were these kind of myths of, oh, you can't trust Pete Carroll, you can't trust Sean McVay, you can't trust any of these guys. And I knew that wasn't really true, just based on playing fantasy for so long and listening to guys like Kyle Shanahan. Like, yeah, you can trust Kyle Shanahan. He is across the board very honest. And as I built the database, I soon realized, because at first I thought, okay, a coach will be a liar or he will tell the truth kind of across the board. But that wasn't the case at all. With Zach Taylor, for instance, completely unreliable on injury coach speak, but pretty reliable on player usage and workload. So it became a really fascinating project to work on and see, who is honest in a certain category, who's misleading in a certain category. But sorry, like just creating this thing initially, I was like, man, this is on the very first coach. The first one I worked on was Pete Carroll. And I thought, man, this is going to be such a game changer because his coach speak was so different in training camp. You could trust his. He had this weird thing where it would flip from training camp to regular season. In the regular season, like you could trust his player usage and not his injuries, and then kind of different in training camp. So I thought, man, this is going to be such a game changer for fantasy. I didn't quite expect it to take off as quickly as it did. I thought it would take a few years or something for people to kind of get into it. But man, the fantasy community has been so welcoming and open to this thing, and I just really appreciate it.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I look at it anytime you drop a tweet, and I think it's super useful. And I think it's another like significant tool where I've referenced it before we even interacted. And Greg's contributing to our draft kit this year, which was cool. And, of course, coming on this podcast. So like we got a little bit to talking in that regard, but I referenced your podcast like with the Kyren Williams the stuff where you were kind of like, going through the trying to decipher whether Sean McVay was sort of telling the truth about the injury, the foot injury. So I thought that was very cool that I referenced your work on a podcast without even knowing you. That's how significant like your tool has become for the industry. And another thing that's become very significant for fantasy managers is knowing where you can find really good rankings. And Billy Muzio, you dropped this massive update. I know you put a tremendous amount of time with it. Anybody who wants to kind of get into the really into it a little bit, Billy, you dropped a top 10 takeaways with the Podfather Matt Kelly yesterday. Highly recommended listen. But basically, Billy, I'll go off the cuff, not even on the show sheet. What was the player that you were most surprised at how high you had them ranked, that maybe you didn't necessarily think they were going to be that highly ranked going in? And also sort of on the flip side, a guy that was a little bit lower ranked than you had anticipated without like diving into your projections and your statistics.
Yeah, there was quite a bit of players that kind of popped up on both sides, the high and the low. But I'd say the running back that came up the highest in my projections this year was Joe Mixon. Gotta love the landing spot, gotta love the offense, gotta love the expected usage, and we're gonna see probably maybe an uptick in some red zone usage this year as well with this offense. And I think that ultimately, I was expecting to see Joe Mixon kind of in the RB 14, 15, 16 range, maybe 17. And he popped up as, in the first run of his projections, he popped up as like RB7. And so I went through and tweaked things, and then he came in ultimately as RB number 9, which I'm comfortable with there. And so I think it was a bit of a shock, though, because it wasn't like he left, like the Bears or some team that wasn't always, scoring in the red zone. And the Bengals were fairly, good, but offensive line concerns there, of course, held him back, and we'll see how he progresses here in Houston.
Yeah, and Mixon's one that I had as a target of mine when I wrote about sort of my dead zone targets and fades. I dropped an article this week. Interesting, Billy, because I agree. I think he's a really easy click. I wonder if the ADP doesn't rise a little bit. He's definitely a player that would be interesting to know the final stats on for this season, though. It sort of would be a testament to just how great this Houston Texans offense is if we see the final stats and Joe Mixon has an incredible amount of rushing touchdowns or something like that. It's this Houston Texans offense really did go in fuego this year, Greg. But Mixon aside, every single guest on Press Coverage and Dynasty Life and First Class Fantasy has to get my incredible question, and that's, if you could know the final stats of any single player this season, who would it be?
That's an easy one for me. It's Jameson Williams, for sure. His range of outcomes just seems so large. And, with what Dan Campbell has been saying, he hasn't been given the wide receiver 2 job yet. Campbell is saying he's pushing for it. He's pushing to be a full-time starter. He's a man on a mission. He looks great in camp, but we haven't heard Campbell say, yeah, he's the locked-in wide receiver 2. Also, there are concerns with what Jameson Williams does best and Jared Goff. Jared Goff not known for, being a great passer in the deep part of the field. And that's where Jameson Williams really kind of excels. So if they have him doing the kind of intermediate stuff, well, that's where Amon-Ra St. Brown and Sam Laporta really kind of live. But the good thing is that they have one of the best offensive coordinators and play callers in all of football. So if he does get that full-time wide receiver 2 role, I think we can see some really diabolical stuff dialed up by Ben Johnson.
Well, that's a great segue into our main focus of the show. We are going to dive into 12 players that are some of the most interesting clicks to make, players that fantasy managers right now have bold takes on one way or another. These 12 players could be very tilting to your draft process. And Billy, Greg, and I are going to attempt to decipher whether these players should be targets of ours or fades. We're going to take a short break. And guess what? Jameson Williams, we're going to hear Billy Muzio's thoughts on Jameson Williams to get us started. We'll be right back.
Hey, why do we partner with the FFPC? Because they have the widest variety of fantasy football formats, and it's the easiest place to find all types of fantasy football contests in the world. What if you want to play for high stakes? Well, they have a $6 million prize pool with their Fantasy Players Championship. They also have way too early best ball leagues that start in February and dynasty leagues. They have the closest thing to a liquid market for orphans that there is in all of Dynasty. And the FFPC has sponsored us for half a decade because we are actually delivering information that can help fantasy gamers, and they're generating so much interest and bringing in so many new users, casual users even. The FFPC creates a unique experience where you can both compete against the best and make money. Use promo code UNDERWORLD to get $25 off your first team. $25 off your first team at the FFPC with promo code UNDERWORLD. Go get it!
Welcome back to First Class Fantasy. Theo Gremminger with Billy Muzio as always, and we're joined by Greg Brainos of the CoachSpeak Index. So Greg talked about his thoughts on Jameson Williams, and I think that Jameson Williams is very much that. It's sort of a little bit of a fantasy skeleton key. You're not getting him cheap right now, Billy. It's a player that a lot of people are betting on to break out. There's a argument that he's going to absorb Josh Reynolds' targets. If he can simply absorb Josh Reynolds' targets, you're talking about a 105 target guy. Plus, when you factor in a couple of the manufactured touches he's going to get on sweeps and anything that, Ben Johnson can kind of cook up, that starts being appealing. But again, opportunity cost of taking him at wide receiver 48 is pretty high. There's some guys around him, Billy, like your guy, Cortland Sutton, Rashee Rice at wide receiver 47, Christian Watson, wide receiver 46, and then Curtis Samuel at wide receiver 50, all sort of bracketing Jameson Williams. So we'll put you on the spot here, Billy. Jameson Williams, wide receiver 48. Is he a click for you? Is he a pass? Or is he a guy where you want a little bit of exposure to?
I want a little bit of exposure just because of the range of outcomes, but I'm not particularly happy at the cost currently. In the projections, he comes in as wide receiver 61, and it's not like I gave him, some chump volume. I gave him 90 targets, which I'm not even quite sure he'll hit, to be honest, just because, to Greg's point, he hit the hammer on the nail, or hit the nail on the hammer, whatever that saying is. 20 deep ball attempts last year was only 2.9 per game. Or I should say 50, which was number 20 in the league for quarterbacks. And so he does not throw the ball deep a lot. When he does, though, he was actually accurate 48% of the time. So it's one of those predicaments where it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because all you need is one catch, for 80 yards and a touchdown, and he's going to hit the numbers that we need him to hit. So it's kind of tantalizing because he could easily surpass his ADP at 48, and he could easily not reach it. And so it's just one of those players that you have to have exposure with, and you have to pay the price because he could easily beat you when it comes time for the money. But he could also beat you the other way and not perform for you.
It's interesting, Billy and Greg, because when we talk about a guy like Jameson Williams really, really hitting big, like him finishing wide receiver 44 is not going to help you when you're drafting him at wide receiver 48. I think that's another misnomer. Beating ADP does not mean a slight micro beating, because it's still, then you have to look at the opportunity cost of the guys you passed up on. It's Jameson Williams giving you like wide receiver 26 and drafting him at wide receiver 48. That's kind of the goal you should make. And when you look at lower targeted wide receivers that really, really produce, Billy, you're talking about Deebo Samuel. You're talking about Brandon Ayuk. Ayuk had 105 targets last year. I think that's sort of the bull case for a guy like Jameson. And Deebo, of course, gets like 90 targets every year and just dominates. Completely different kind of player, though. Greg, anything to add on Jameson Williams, sort of where your comfort level is of drafting him right around ADP?
I think he's getting really expensive right now. And for redraft, you're looking at possibly a really volatile player who's going to give you a headache every week. Someone who will just give you nightmares, like Michael Floyd back in the days. All right, man, Jameson hasn't done much. Got to bench him this week, and he pops off for 25 points. While I believe Dan Campbell that Jameson Williams is pushing for this wide receiver 2 spot, it's and this is a really cool thing. Well, I don't know if it's cool. It's actually kind of annoying, but with CoachSpeak, a coach can be right about a player. It can come to fruition what they say, and that player still doesn't pay off ADP. That player still really antagonizes you on a weekly basis in redraft. But looking at the history of what Dan Campbell has said about him, it is trending in a very positive direction. And Dan Campbell, I mean, this is one of the most honest coaches in the league when it comes to CoachSpeak. I remember last season in the offseason, they asked him, hey, what's up with Denzel Mims? What do you think about him? And he said, all I can tell you is that he's in the room. And they cut him like 1 or 2 days later. So, looking back, August of last year, what he says about Jameson Williams, we just got to keep working through it. We got to keep working through it. Same thing in October. We got to keep working. We're just going to keep working. And then it starts to get more positive in December. We want to find other creative ways to use them. We'll keep working to find some different ways to get him more involved. And then February of this year, he's going to push to be a full-time starter now. That's what we're looking at. He's only going to get better and better and better. And then we saw they let Josh Reynolds walk in free agency. They didn't draft a pass catcher. And then we get the, man on a mission quote from Dan Campbell. So it's definitely trending in a very positive direction. What we hear in training camp is going to be really key.
Yeah, I love it. And I would say Dan Campbell is one of the most likable head coaches in the NFL. Like nobody, unless you're like just a complete nerd, then you love Dan Campbell. He's a guy you kind of root for even when he's making mistakes. And one other coach that is extremely likable, for fantasy managers and also just NFL fans alike, is Mike McDaniel. And that's an offense that drafters are betting on big time in every sense, in dynasty, in best ball, and in redraft. And we're going to talk about a couple of Miami Dolphins. But the Miami Dolphin that we're going to talk about first is easily the lowest ranked player in terms of ADP, but a guy who's starting to pick up a little bit of steam compared to a lot of the guys on this list. And that's Jonnu Smith. One thing that's interesting about Jonnu Smith is, he's tight end 26 on Underdog, but this is a guy who structurally is very important. Whether you're an underdog drafter who's trying to wait on your tight end 2 or take a tight end 3, he's been very appealing. If you're an underdog drafter that's trying to build on your Miami stack, he's appealing. And then Billy, for people who play FFPC like myself, you're talking about Jonnu as a guy that I can basically do draft an anchor tight end, whether it's a 350 or a best ball, and then get a little bit of a discount on my tight end too. It allows me to attack other positions. So I think structurally, Jonnu is very important. Start with Greg on this, because Greg, you had a tweet where Mike McDaniel sort of talked about his reputation of being a guy who doesn't use the tight end position.
Yeah, he said some people think that just whatever it was, it will always be. Just saying that just because we didn't use a tight end last year doesn't mean that we're not going to do that this year. And he went on to talk about how difficult it's going to be to defend this offense. I mean, you got Tyreek Hill, you got Jalen Waddle, and then you have now this yak monster in Jonnu Smith. I mean, we saw him destroy in Tennessee, alongside AJ Brown and Derrick Henry, and didn't do much in New England and popped off a little bit last year in Atlanta thanks to Arthur Smith. But this is by far the best offense that he's ever been a part of. And Mike McDaniel can scheme it up, man. Like, you have a weakness in your defense, he's going to exploit that. And I just think with Jonnu Smith's skill set, we're going to see some really big spike weeks from him. And I don't know about redraft, like how much you'll be able to depend on him on a weekly basis. Certainly, good enough if you have an elite tight end, one of the top 7 or 9 guys, and they have a bye week. Absolutely, plug Jonnu Smith in there. Maybe you'll hit it really big. But I think he can be a really good piece in this offense that doesn't run a lot of 11 personnel. Like, they don't have a lot of 3 wide historically. So it could be, you know, the running backs, the 2 wide receivers, and then, okay, you want to play off Jonnu Smith. Here we go.
Jonnu Smith had 69 targets last year, Billy, caught 50 balls. And what's interesting about Jonnu is if you ask somebody like, hey, how old Jonnu? It feels like Jonnu has been in the league literally forever. He's 28 years old, which for a tight end is definitely fine. I think it's interesting because, you know, like Greg alluded to, you're going to get those massive spike weeks. And at the end of the day, if you're playing like tight end Russian roulette and using like those lower ranked tight ends, having a guy who can provide you a spike week, even a redraft, it's a kind of a high EV strategy. There's a lot of tight ends out there. I mean, you could go Tyler Conklining or a guy like to that regard and, you know, get your little 8 points. But when you have a guy in this sort of an offense, you know, it's appealing. Billy, what do you think about Jonnu Smith? Is he a guy that you're betting on to beat ADP? Is he a guy that you're comfortable drafting not only in best ball, but potentially in redraft?
First, shout out to you, Theo, for using Conklin as a verb there. That was
I could have said Cade. I could have said he was Cade Ottening, but then I would have offended you because you love Cade Otten.
I do like Cade Otten. Jonnu's, so it's interesting. He is a yak monster and 11.6 yards per reception last year in 2023. The last time he sniffed that was in 2021 at 10.5, in 2020 at 10.9. He had that big dip in 2022 at 9.1. So I do expect him to get closer to that 11 yard per reception this year. I've been projected for 11.1. And it could be more just because this offense is so spread, and it's just going to depend upon the usage, of course. I don't have him quite for the target that he had last year. 69 is a bit of a stretch, I think, this year. I have him in that 58 range, 57.5 to be exact. And so I'm bullish on him. It's not like I'm extremely bullish, though. I have him as tight end 22. ADP right now is tight end 26, so just a slight uptick. There's quite a bit. There's a big tier there. It's about 8 to 9 fantasy points separating him from, you know, the Luke Musgraves, the Cade Ottens, and so can he get there? Absolutely, but I'm probably pulling the trigger on those guys just because of it's going to be probably a little bit more consistent usage here on a week-to-week basis than Jonnu, but I think Jonnu has a wide range of outcomes this year.
So we definitely spent a longer time discussing Jonnu Smith than pretty much any podcast that anybody's listened to probably in the last 2 weeks. So let's go with somebody a little more exciting, and that's my guy, Brock Bowers. Brock Bowers, this is you're not getting any discount. There's no rookie tight end discount. His ADP is not quite steamed up like Kyle Pitts's in 2021, but Billy, we're seeing Bowers ahead of where Dalton Kincaid was last year, and Kincaid had some steam. He's also going certainly ahead of where Laporta was, even though Laporta had that late summer, like if you're drafting very end of August, you were paying like tight end 12. But Bowers is sitting there right now at tight end 10 on Underdog. This has actually come down a little bit, but tight end 10, you're still paying a premium tight end price. I'm in on this price. Greg, where are you at on Brock Bowers?
I'm very in on Brock Bowers at this price. I think he is an elite tight end that you're getting at one of those middling prices, you know, where David Njoku, Jake Ferguson go. The Raiders had some real needs on the offensive line, and they drafted Brock Bowers 13th overall when they have a pretty good tight end already. That shows you how much they love this guy. They wanted another offensive weapon. They're already talking about they want to play him in the slot. They want to put him on the outside. They want him to take, reverses and sweeps. They really want to use him in this offense. Everyone that's talked about him, from the GM Tom Telesco to Antonio Pierce to their new OC Luke Getsy. I mean, they have a real plan for Brock Bowers. And Antonio Pierce last year, as soon as he got the job, he said, you know, back in the day with the Dallas Cowboys, it was Michael Irvin and Emmitt Smith. And we are going to get the ball to our best players. And if you look at this offense, Brock Bowers is their second most talented player on that offense. So it's going to be Devontae Adams, it's going to be Brock Bowers, and it's going to be Zamir White.
And what's interesting with Bowers is there's also a lot of the beat reporters there alluding to the fact that he's going to see a ton of time in the slot, which is like you can line him up on the outside. You can have him run wide receiver routes, but they're also going to use him in the slot, which is sort of a little bit of a life preserver to anybody who drafted Michael Mayer in early best balls, but we're not talking about him. Billy Muzio, you are going to break my heart if you pour cold water on drafting Brock Bowers at ADP. Go for it.
No, and you know I have a lot of trepidation when it comes to rookie tight ends. But Bowers actually comes in on a tier of his own, right at tight end 11, which is right at ADP, and that was unplanned. It was, I didn't manipulate things. I didn't come in.
I Venmo'd Billy.
I did not come in here thinking I was going to be, reducing any workload here just because he was a rookie tight end. I just went through the metrics. I went through the target share and broke it down how I envisioned it to be, and he came in. It really is a tier in its own. Like a lot of these tight ends, you look at, like for instance, tight end 17 to like tight end number 21 is separated by no more than 6 fantasy points. You go from tight end number 1 to tight end number 5, it's separated by no more than 10 fantasy points. And he is between tight end 10 and tight end 11. I have it separated by 10. And between tight end 11 and tight end 12, I have it separated by nearly 10. So he really truly is in kind of a tier of his own here at tight end 11, where even if you adjust the ones ahead of him or below him, he's probably going to stay at this spot for quite some time unless some serious news breaks out. I guess the question I have for Greg, because I really have been looking for this, is have we seen any coach speak on 12 personnel inside of the Raiders territory? And do they plan on going 12 personnel? Because with the receiving weapons they have, it looks like they could shift that way.
They've talked about using Brock Bowers and Michael Mayer at the same time, not necessarily talking about, hey, this is, we're looking to run 12 more, but the clearest thing to me is that we're going to use the hell out of Brock Bowers. It is not going to surprise me at all if we see Brock Bowers end the year as, a tight end 5 or 6.
Yeah, seems like they're going to run like a jumbo X and maybe throw him in the slot too. So perfect.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's super interesting, and Billy's, not going to sit there tooting his own horn, but Billy finished number 1 overall in the Fantasy Pros rankings. That was 2022. Correct me if I'm wrong, Billy.
2021. Number
2021
4th.
Okay, so Billy has two top 5 Fantasy Pros ranking competition titles under his belt, or which is incredible. Getting one of those is like a forever flex. So Billy's done it twice. But Billy, my question to you is, and I'll say Billy, when he does his projections, they're top notch. He's going to go rankings. They're a little different than projections, but almost it's very similar. Billy, if you are 10% wrong on Bowers, and he is 10% better than your projections, have him at right now, where would he finish?
Tight end 8.
So there you go, guys. So Billy, the upside is there, and Billy talked about like the wide, you get into these scoring, tiers of tight ends where it can be like a wider range of players. Bowers could have just a few more spike weeks, a few more, like a couple of 2 touchdown games, and all of a sudden, like Greg said, he's tight end 5. Click that button on Brock Bowers. We expect him to have a very fast start to his NFL career. Now, this is one that Billy did. A couple of these guys on the list were ones Billy gave me. A number were the ones that Greg gave me. I put one name on the list because this is a guy that Billy and I went back and forth on all last offseason. Billy was correct on this one. I was incorrect, and that's Jackson Smith-Njigba. JSN was a guy that I was betting on. We had a long-running bet. Billy won it. Hat tip to you, Billy. You won one on me. Congratulations. Let everybody know about it. But now JSN is entering into year 2. And what's interesting to me is, there's a lot of people out there betting on him to be a lot better this season. But we had a incredibly large group of wide receivers that were being drafted inside of the NFL's first round. A couple of these guys, and also the second round. And what's interesting to me is a number of these guys have leaped JSN in early ADP. Right now, JSN is going off the board as wide receiver 44 on Underdog. This has been a guy that I've been clicking the button on, certainly at this deflated price. Right now, he's going behind Ladd McConkey. He's going behind Keon Coleman. He's going behind Brian Thomas. He's going behind Rome Odunze. So all the rookies are ahead of him. JSN year 2. Start with Billy on this one. Where are you at on JSN?
I think you'd be happy to know, Theo, that I have him above the Underdog ADP. all the way up to wide receiver 43 this year. So one spot ahead of the underdog ADP. I do have him, though, ahead of Keon Coleman. I have him behind Ladd McConkey. So just take that with, for what it's worth. I'm just not entirely certain that Tyler Conklin's going to have this disappearing act that everybody's assuming he's going to have. And I understand he's getting up there in age. He's almost 32. But he's been consistently healthy on the field, 16, 17 games since pretty much his rookie season in 2015. I don't think he's just going to fall off a cliff. And I understand some of the metrics fell off a little bit last year, but he still had 900 yards. He still had 5 touchdowns. He's still a trusted target in the offense. And so I'm a bit higher on Tyler Lockett than the looks like consensus is, or even, drafters are inside of draft rooms. But I think that's still going to limit the ceiling here for Jack Smith-Njigba. I would not take the bet this year with you, Theo, that he would not reach wide receiver 36 or 37, whatever it was. I think that's definitely within the range of possibilities. It's not somebody I think is going to crush ADP. I could see him easily finish as wide receiver 35 through 43 pretty easily. But I do think that he's priced appropriately this year, where last year it was a clear, obvious mispriced player.
So the Seattle Seahawks hired one of the offensive coordinators that was really exciting for me to see. I love when NFL teams sort of think outside the box. Mike McDonald was hired as the head coach. He came from Michigan to the Baltimore Ravens as the defensive coordinator. Now we see Ryan Grubb, who was the offensive coordinator at Washington. Washington, of course, made their run to the national title game and had all those guys drafted in the NFL draft. But Ryan Grubb was incredible at Washington. He was also incredible at Fresno State. The guy is associated with protecting the quarterback and also being a very efficient passing game, and also, of course, being very proficient, as we saw last year with like Michael Penix lighting it up with like Roma Dunze and Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk, all drafted. But Greg, the coach speak from Mike McDonald regarding JSN has been nothing but positive. Apparently, he did very well at the OTAs. You don't have any reference here on whether we can trust Mike McDonald, but he certainly seems excited about him, doesn't he?
Yeah, he is very into JSN. A couple weeks ago, he said, I think we've got a really cool plan for him. And then yesterday at his press conference said he's definitely going to be a massive piece of what we're trying to do offensively. We talked earlier about if you could see the final stats for one player, who would it be? If I could see the final stats for one offense, it would be Seattle, because I like Jameson Williams, I believe, has this big range of outcomes. I think the Seattle offense has a big range of outcomes because it kind of hinges on their offensive line, which is pretty decent. Right tackle Abe Lucas had surgery on his knee in the offseason. They're not sure if he's going to be ready for training camp, but Ryan Grubb's offense asks a lot of the offensive line, and it's so important that they keep pressure off of Geno Smith, because those splits of pressure and no pressure are pretty big. And I do think that this offense is going to run the ball a little more than people are expecting.
Yep.
But the trade-off of that is that Ryan Grubb is so good at scheming his wide receivers to be open by like 10, 15 yards. And obviously the NFL is a little bit different game than college, but when you have a really good offensive mind in there, and I think Ryan Grubb is a really big step up from Shane Waldron, who is just using JSN as kind of a screen merchant last year. And you could see in press conferences how frustrated Pete Carroll was with the work that Waldron was doing, especially in relation to JSN. I think Ryan Grubb is the guy to kind of unlock what Jackson Smith-Njigba is capable of.
The last thing I'll add, I think it's really interesting, Greg, you brought up the offense, and Billy and I are probably going to do a show about offenses that could raise a bunch of players in ADP sometime this month. But right now, Seattle, Ken Walker goes off the board as like running back 16. DK Metcalf is wide receiver 22. JSN wide receiver 44, Tyler Lockett wide receiver 51, and Zach Charbonnet is down there. He's like somewhere in the wide receiver running back 40 range. So there's a chance that all 5 of those guys could beat their ADP, or 4 out of 5 could beat ADP. And then we talk about the quarterback position. Geno is extremely cheap right now. So that's definitely an offense to keep an eye on. And another offense to keep an eye on is the Tennessee Titans. We've talked about this at length on First Class Fantasy about how we expect this offense to be passing the ball a lot more. And one thing that's interesting is the running back spot. You have very polarizing opinions from drafters on which running back we should target. This is not a backfield that we could recommend double tapping. Maybe on underdog occasionally you could double tap Pollard and Spears, but for our redraft managers, that's a little bit too much of an ask, and I think it could end up being a potential split you're holding. But let's say it's not a split. Let's say that Tony Pollard or Tyjae Spears end up, one of them ends up with like 65% of the running back production in this offense. That's an interesting proposition because we think they're going to pass a lot of high volume touches for the running backs. Start with Greg on this one. You put Tyjae Spears as the guy you want to talk about today on the show. Talk about him.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think this gets any bigger than a 60-40 split in favor of Pollard. I think we're probably looking more at, 55-45. Their new OC, Nick Holtz, called them 1A and 1B. Brian Callahan, the entire offseason, has been talking about how interchangeable these two are, which I think is really smart, and we might see more of this going forward in the NFL. We see with the Rams and Sean McVay getting Kyren Williams 2.0 over there, having two backs who are completely interchangeable, and you can just keep doing whatever you want to do with your offense and keep defenses guessing on looks. It's not a tell when you have a certain running back in there. And Callahan, on top of talking about how much he wants to pass the ball this year in Tennessee, like they are going to sling the ball. He's been talking a lot about how much they want to use the running backs in the pass game and in screens and getting them matched up against linebackers. They're both good at catching the ball. I think this favors Spears a little bit more. I think he probably gets a few more targets than Pollard does. And then just him going a couple rounds after Pollard, really, really like that value there.
So both of these players had over 50 receptions last year. Tyjae Spears gave us a 52 reception season, which was very notable because we saw many years of Tennessee. Since Dion Lewis, there really wasn't a Tennessee running back catching a significant amount of passes. That's only because the big dog was eating on the ground. But Billy, Tyjae was a fast starter. He gets steamed up to like running back 18 pre-NFL draft underdog ADP. Now he's settled in at running back 34. But this is very much an ambiguous backfield where you have Tony Pollard as running back 29, Tyjae Spears as running back 34. Which of these two players, if you had to draft one, would you be clicking the button on?
I'm going to consistently click the one lower at ADP right now just because I have them so tight in the rankings. Currently, I have Pollard as RB21. I have Spears as RB26. And then in draft rooms, we're seeing them go as, RB30? Let me see here. RB34 for Spears. And Pollard is going as like RB28 or 29. And so sometimes you see one get chosen ahead of the other, and I'll take the latter inside of draft rooms. But it's kind of an odd choice that Pollard landed here, I think, quite frankly, because they're very similar in the fact that their running style, as well as they're both very capable pass catchers. It's not your traditional lightning and thunder. This is almost like two lightnings in the backfield, and it's going to be interesting to see how the split is done. I do agree here with Greg. I have Tyjae Spears edging out Tony Pollard in the receiving game, but I do have Tony Pollard edging out Spears in the rushing game. I got Tony Pollard 45% of the rushing share, and I got Spears at 36.5% of the rushing share. For those listening, you got to keep in mind you have to add quarterbacks in there, and you got to add all the RB3, 4s, and 5s in there. They're going to have 2 carries, 3 carries, 5 carries, etc. So when it breaks down to it, it's a pretty close split, and I got Tony Pollard with a slight edge.
Yeah, and I've heard Callahan discuss a little bit about how it puts pressure on defenses because of the now they can be kind of unpredictable with their play calling. if you have a starting running back whose play style is very different from the backup, you think of like a traditional third down back versus like an inside runner, the defense kind of knows what's coming from the running back spot. Whereas with these guys, they can basically run the exact same offense at all times, which is, I think, super interesting. And it's sort of a way to sort of support Will Levis's like ascension with easy dump offs to both these guys. And Billy Muzio being ahead of consensus on not one, but both of them kind of tells me you should be drafting Tennessee Titans.
Well, I would like to caveat to say I'm ahead of the running backs. I'm not ahead on the passing game.
Well, listen, we gotta keep this. We got more players to talk about. I will correct myself. Billy Muzio gives you the green light to draft Tennessee Titans running backs.
Yes.
Go ahead with that. Greg, let's talk about F1 Terry McLaurin. If I was going to write an article today on 5 players that I expect to have a higher ADP on September 1 than July 1, I would say F1 is going to be one of them. Right now, he's going off the board as wide receiver 31, but there's been nothing but positive vibes out of Washington when people are discussing F1 and also Jaden Daniels and sort of the connection that they're building and the confidence level people have in this offense within the Washington organization. Your thoughts on F1, Terry McLaurin, who's had 4 really solid seasons. He's had 4 years over 75 grabs and over 1,000 receiving yards, but he hasn't had that one season where people are like, oh my God, look what F1 did that year. Your thoughts on him this year with Jaden Daniels?
Yeah, the stars are really aligning for Terry McLaurin this season. First of all, you get Dan Quinn and Cliff Kingsbury there. And Dan Quinn has been saying the same things in Washington that he was saying in Atlanta about what he wants to do on offense. He wants to run the ball in the high 20s, and he wants to take deep shots off of play action, and a real emphasis on deep passing. When they asked him at the combine, what do you want in a quarterback? He said, 2 top traits. One is mental and physical toughness. The second is deep ball accuracy. And if you, like you mentioned, Terry McLaurin, the last 4 seasons, he's one of only 6 wide receivers to record at least 1,000 yards. Also, in those last 4 seasons, he's been in the bottom third of catchable target rate every single season. And Jaden Daniels last year, only FBS quarterback to throw for 10 plus air yards per attempt and have a catchable throw rate of at least 80%. So this lines up really well with Terry McLaurin's skill set. John Keim, who is a tremendous Washington beat reporter, said that he hasn't heard Terry McLaurin talk about any quarterback in this manner. I mean, they're already on the same page, and I think it's just going to work out really well. Cliff Kingsbury in his 4 years at Arizona, first in no huddle rate, first in offensive plays. This is going to be a much more efficient offense. And you've got the fact that Jaden Daniels can use his legs on second and long and third and long to keep drives going. So I think they get a lot more offensive plays. This is likely going to be a pretty heavy RPO offense, which usually means that's really good for the wide receiver one. They're the first read. It's wheels up for Terry McLaurin this season.
I'm with you, and I've said that I think that Terry McLaurin could be this year's DJ Moore. A player that has his best fantasy season with this, mobile, improved quarterback play like we saw last year with DJ Moore in Chicago, who finished as wide receiver 6. Billy, can Terry McLaurin finish as a wide receiver 1 this year, or is he going to be a guy that people drafted wide receiver 31 and he doesn't move the needle for him?
I think more the latter. I don't think he'll finish as wide receiver 1 or as a wide receiver 1. Wide receiver back in wide receiver 2 pretty easily, I think. There's a tier of wide receivers here from wide receiver 19 in my rankings all the way down to wide receiver 32 that's separated by 10 fantasy points. So it's kind of like pick your poison in this range. There's just so many outcomes for all these guys. I think Terry McLaurin's going to have a solid year, but I don't think it's going to, rock ADP off its socks.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. And I think that, again, like, you're putting him as, he's still an ADP value wide receiver 31, even with Billy's take right here, where, again, but it's a Is he a purgatory player, or is he a guy that can return tremendous value? I'm going to lean towards I want to have a lot of F1, but we'll see how this ADP goes throughout the summer. Billy, that becomes a more interesting conversation if he steams up to like wide receiver 22, wide receiver 23 range, then wide receiver 31. One wide receiver that this very polarizing. Billy and I talked about him earlier this offseason right here on First Class Fantasy, and that is Chris Godwin. Greg, you brought up Chris Godwin, and you also brought up Jalen McMillan. And it's sort of an inverse here where Chris Godwin's bumping back into the slot, and Jalen McMillan has a chance to see a lot of work, outside, opposite of Mike Evans at like a flanker position. Talk about these guys, Greg, your thoughts on Godwin and also McMillan in Tampa Bay here.
Yeah, so Chris Godwin in his first 3 seasons in the slot, 51%, 53%, 60%. Last year, 32% of his snaps were in the slot. Todd Bowles said he's an inside guy by nature. He can play outside, but he can make a living inside doing a bunch of things for us, and we plan to let him do a lot of things that he does best. And then their new offensive coordinator, Liam Cohen, when he had his first press conference, talked about how dynamic Chris Godwin is on the inside, and said that he envisions Godwin more on the inside playing that F position that ultimately Cooper Kupp played. Liam Cohen was the OC with the Rams under Sean McVay. So huge for Godwin, I believe, with his usage this season. And then, yeah, they're really talking up Jalen McMillan. I mean, nothing but good things. Talking about his versatility. He can play 3 positions, and he can play at all 3 phases on the field as a receiver. And you can get him in the last round of drafts. I think he's gonna do really well for him this season. And if something happens to Evans or to Godwin, having that versatility of being able to play those 3 positions. And then we saw his productivity at Washington, alongside guys like Roman Dunze in 2022. This is a guy who has the stuff, and Baker Mayfield is already loving him, talking about how explosive he is. And Liam Cohen coming from the McVay tree. This is an offense that's going to throw the ball a decent amount. So I'm in on Godwin. I'm in on McMillan, and Mike Evans obviously as well.
I made the contingent upside argument for McMillan, where you can't name an older set of wide receivers than Godwin and Evans right now in the NFL. Maybe there's one. Off the top of my head, there isn't. So McMillan, if one of those guys misses time, he was more productive than Jalen Polk in 2022. And Polk, of course, was a top 40 selection this year. McMillan dealt with some injuries last year. But Billy, you've kind of been a little hesitant on Godwin. Where does he come in on your rankings?
So the initial reputation was because I hadn't finished the rankings. When I finished the rankings, I was like, holy crap, I'm mentally too low on Godwin, just because the numbers didn't match up with what I was, thinking. And when we saw the report that he was moving back to the slot, it definitely bumped him up inside of the projection. So this is one of those, we talked about this yesterday on the top 10 takeaways. It's one of those kind of scenarios where people are ageist and they think Godwin's really older than he really is. He's only 28. Everyone thinks he's like 33. And they just continue to pass on him right now inside of draft rooms. And we're seeing him go right now as wide receiver 37 in draft rooms. And in the projections right now, he comes in as wide receiver 28. So pretty big value inside of the projection sheet versus the ADP room. And I've been smashing the button now pretty consistently when I see him inside of drafts. And it's another one of those interesting kind of dichotomies where we see the wide receiver 2, quote unquote, out target the wide receiver 1 on the team pretty consistently year in and year out. And so last year was the first year since, the Godwin injury in 2020 that Evans actually out targeted Chris Godwin. So I am back in on Godwin now that the projections are done, and the model is in, and that we're seeing that he's taking more slot reps. And I think that, 37 right now, he's mispriced inside of draft rooms.
I love drafting correlation between Evans, Godwin, and McMillan. I love when I draft one of the starters to draft McMillan as well. I think there's a lot of positive correlation there, not only on Underdog, but in NFFC or FFPC drafts as well, Billy, because I think the market on McMillan is going to move up. Greg, you had one thing to add?
Yeah, I was just going to add, the other day, Todd Bowles was talking about Jalen McMillan, and he referred to Trey Palmer and the rest of the receivers as being behind Jalen McMillan. Trey Palmer, 0.87 yards per route run last year. Not good.
Yeah, and also, the whole Trey Palmer has got a little bit of a hive there. Trey Palmer was a 6th-round pick versus Jalen McMillan, a 3rd-round pick. That is significant in terms of the hit rates. Not too many 6th-rounders out there giving you weekly starts. 3rd-rounders have been hitting lately. Tank Dell was a 3rd-rounder last year. Josh Downs was a 3rd-rounder. Terry McLaurin was a 3rd-rounder. Guys, that we're into. Guys, let's make this one a lightning round one. Pittsburgh Steeler running back. Arthur Smith has been sort of a fantasy football villain in terms of what he does for the wide receivers and the tight ends, but he's really good with the running backs, guys. You're talking about Derrick Henry had his incredible seasons in Tennessee with Arthur Smith as his OC. Bijan Robinson last year, frustrating usage, but still finishes as an RB1 as a rookie. Cordero Patterson, the most out there RB1 finish, maybe of all time, Billy. And then Tyler Algier, a middling talent, solid running back, but he gets a 1,000-yard rookie season under Arthur Smith. Now you've got drafters making a decision here. Last year, Jalen Warren finished ahead of Najee Harris in PPR. Obviously, Najee was a bust where you drafted him, and Jalen Warren was a hit where you drafted him. Now, Billy, they are literally neck and neck. What is your projection saying as the running back that you should target? Najee Harris goes off the board on Underdog as running back 21, and Jalen Warren goes off the board as running back 25. FFPC, it's similar to that.
I have bet 20 and 25, so I'm in lockstep with ADP right now. I get slightly into Najee just because of the touchdowns, and Arthur Smith is a little bit more of a I don't want to call him a Neanderthal, but let's just call it old school football, where he's going to play it pretty black and white, and they're going to get in the red zone. I think Najee's going to get the ball, and that's where the slight lean is.
I will lean Jalen Warren all day long. I think Jalen Warren is the kind of back that can really crush his ADP. Over 60 receptions last year. We do have the Cordero Patterson, potential in terms of interesting usage at the running back spot. Najee also has been super fortunate with his injuries. Billy, he's always banged up and he's always playing. Greg, you be the decider here. Jalen Warren or Najee Harris?
Oh man, this is tough. If you look at Arthur Smith's history, which you pointed out, the common theme between all those running backs, Arthur Smith loves thumpers, and Najee Harris and Jalen Warren are both thumpers. Arthur Smith was speaking, I believe it was yesterday, about if they have 1,100 plays this year, basically saying 550 of them, half of them are going to be runs, and there's plenty of carries to go around. Najee Harris almost 300 touches last year. Jalen Warren 210. Jalen Warren a little bit more efficient than Najee Harris. I mean, they're both good plays.
All right, so there we go. Greg, you got both good plays. Billy's on Najee, but he's got Jalen close, and I'm on Jalen. So go ahead and draft yourself some Jalen. Don't listen to that Muzio guy. Not like he had 2 top 5 fantasy pros finishes in the rankings competition. Guys, now we're in the big 3. These 3 players we're going to end the show with, these are tilting. A year ago at this time, none of us would have predicted that these guys were being drafted where they are going currently. That being said, if they hit, they could be massive hits. If they fail, these could be like, huge tilting losses for fantasy managers. We're going to go ahead and start out with Nico Collins. Nico Collins, we talk about, 3rd-year breakouts. Last year ends up finishing as wide receiver 12, was simply sensational in the NFL playoffs, and he was re-signed this offseason with Houston for a 3-year, $72 million extension. So Nico got the bag. He got the production. He's going off the board right now as wide receiver 14. In NFFC, Billy, he's inside of the 2nd round. FFPC, he's early 3rd. So he's cost a lot right now. Greg, in or out on Nico Collins at ADP?
I'm in. He's an unbelievable talent. I'll just say this and I'll stop talking. Go subscribe to Reception Perception and look at Nico Collins' profile.
Well, Nico Collins, yeah, I see Matt Harmon's definitely way up on him, and the metrics people love Nico. I like he clicks off a lot of like the key metrics, like yards per route run. He's very very proficient. He also has that alpha outside size, and there's an argument to be made that you take him and you fade Stephon Diggs. It's sort of a younger versus older proposition. They're dead set in ADP. I definitely would be Nico over Stephon Diggs. Billy, where are you at on that one?
This is coming from a guy who loved Nico, who had 55% of Nico last year inside draft rooms. And I have to say, unfortunately, it's hard to pull the trigger at wide receiver 14 just because of the range of outcomes that he has with the new competition for targets. This was one of the hardest wide receiving cores to predict this year because they added Stephon Diggs. They still have Nico Collins we're talking about. They still have Tank Dell. Noah Brown actually did well last year. They still have Dalton Schultz. Joe Mixon usually catches between 40 and 50 balls. So there's a lot of competition for targets here. And I have to say, as much as I like Nico, wide receiver 14 now is pretty steamed up. And I get that he, finished above that last year in fantasy points per game, but we're asking a big ask here with a bunch of target competition from him. And this ball could be spread more than people are wanting to. And I think that wide receiver 20 is probably more likely in the cards than wide receiver 14.
And then the big, cloud hanging over both Diggs and Collins is Tank Dell at wide receiver 26. The splits with Dell and Collins when they played together, they were both productive when they were on the field together. It's can this offense support a third wide receiver plus Joe Mixon balling out plus Dalton Schultz? And does Noah Brown completely disappear? That's not one we're really projecting to do much, but he did have some big games last year as well. But I will agree with Greg. I think Nico is very talented, but that doesn't always necessarily mean the massive production ceiling. Guys, now it gets even spicier. Let's talk about the Miami running back room. Right now, you've got Devon Achane, who's been one of my guys at Player Profiler, running back 7 overall and underdog. You've also got Raheem Mostert, who's been schemed up. He's at running back 28. And then you've got Jalen Wright in the wings. Greg, which is the Miami running back that we should be drafting at ADP right now?
I want the best one. I want Devon Achane. People ask, I don't know if he can stay healthy. Who thought that Raheem Mostert was going to stay healthy for all of last season? Mostert's 32 years old. He'll be very close to 33 by the time the fantasy playoffs get here. We saw the insane efficiency that Devon Achane provides. Now imagine he gets 40%, 50%, 60% of carries. It's to the moon with this guy under Mike McDaniel.
And I'll say this, guys, there were people fading Alvin Kamara heading into year 2. There's always people who sort of can't believe it and want guys to come back to earth. This could be a Jamal Charles situation. This could be a Chris Johnson situation. This could be a real outlier. I'm not going to say anything else about him because I've had some criticism that I talk about him on every single show. So I'm going to pass it over to Billy Muzio. Billy Muzio, should we be drafting Devon Achane or should we be looking to a different Miami running back? Because we want to have a Miami running back in our build. This is not like a team we're going to pass up on.
I like the way you phrase this because now I can actually answer it where I'm not going to be attacked in the comments for throwing ice on the situation. But if the running back to own in this backfield is Devon Achane, that being said, though, I think where he's steamed up to be is kind of high. I mean, we're relying strictly on his efficiency. He averaged, over 7 yards a carry, 7.77. And even if we, taper that down with the increased volume to over 6 yards a carry, which is extremely high in the NFL. And I can't quite get him up to 55, 60%. That's going to be 235, 255 rushing attempts. And I don't think his body can hold up to that. I think he's more of a 170, 180 guy. And that to me is like RB13. So I like him. I don't like the cost right now. I think he has every opportunity to surpass that because he's extremely talented and he's electric, but I have a little trepidation based upon size, health, and volume.
Anytime Devon Achane balls out this year, I want you to tweet at FF Muzio. All right. And if he finishes RB1 overall, you gotta keep tweeting at Billy Muzio. all day long. So keep drafting him, keep clicking that button.
You know,
Everybody.
that's a dirty move because I can't tweet at you when he gets hurt now, or if he
No,
does.
you can't. Twitter will kill you. You get canceled on that one. Guys, let's finish this out with a bang. So Devon Achane was a 3rd round NFL pick. But when we talk about running backs last year who made huge impacts in their weeks they started, Kyren Williams is one of them. Kyren Williams finishes a top 5 back last year. At this time, people were drafting Cam Akers in like the 6th round. Kyren was going in like round 18. Kyren ends up being a huge waiver wire pickup for many managers and for other managers who took him at the end of their best ball builds or drafted him in the final rounds. They got like found money. He was unbelievable. This is also a 190-pound running back. And last year, guys, he had 228 carries. So Kyren Williams has been a very polarizing click for many drafters. Some view him as a guy who could give you top five production now at the beginning of the 3rd round. Others are like, I'm okay, I'm passing on this profile. Then you get the Blake Corum selection, where there's people betting on Blake Corum as one of the best handcuff running backs to select based on his contingent upside. Greg, Kyren Williams, in or out?
Absolutely in at his current ADP, where he's falling, back end of the 3rd round, sometimes into the 4th round. Les Snead, the Rams GM, said that the Blake Corum pick is so we don't just totally run down Kyren. They don't want to miss a beat whenever Kyren has to come out of the game for a breather, or if he gets injured, like we saw last year when he went on IR. It was a real mess on the depth chart behind him. McVay has to have a running back that he trusts. So far, it seems like he trusts Blake Corum, but we don't know how that's going to turn out. Maybe Blake Corum ends up becoming a bust, and McVay is not going to mix anyone else in with Kyren. It's going to be 85% Kyren Williams out there. If Corum isn't, good enough for McVay, who has very high standards. If Corum is trusted by McVay, I think it's going to be about a 70-30 split between the two. Maybe Corum siphons some goal line work, but McVay is constantly staying ahead of the curve in the NFL. He sees that linebacking cores are getting smaller. So what did he do? He beefed up his offensive line, just 5 mammoths there. And he's going to run the ball with Kyren Williams.
Billy Muzio, Kyren Williams, in your rankings, where does he come in?
RB10, so I'm right around ADP. I'm slightly behind, but now he's kind of fallen into that spot where the back in the 3rd, like we said. So I'm in at that cost. I fully agree here with Greg. I think Kyren dominates the backfield. McVay's a finicky individual with running backs, and we saw that with Akers. And once he chooses a guy, he leans into that guy. And I don't think that I like Corum a lot, and I think he'll be involved. But I also agree that it's not going to be as much as everybody thinks unless there's an injury.
And also, I say the bull case for Kyren is he only had 32 receptions. Maybe with more experience under his belt, that 32 turns into 58 this year and sort of elevates his floor. Sorry to Matt Kelly, the podfather, if you're listening in on this one, but I'm also in on Kyren Williams in the middle of the 3rd round. Was not in the middle of the 2nd, but he's been an easy click for me on Underdog. This has been a ton of fun. Greg, let everybody know where they can find your work once again.
Yeah, on Twitter at CoachSpeak Index. My website is CoachSpeakIndex.com, and I'm launching the CoachSpeak Index podcast at the end of next week.
Look for that one. Look for all Billy's work here, and look for Billy and I back with another First Class Fantasy next week. Enjoy your weekend. We'll see you soon.
Hey, I want to thank you for being part of this broadcast. If you have any thoughts on it, leave a comment. If you enjoyed it, make sure you leave a like. And if you want to see more shows on the Player Profiler channel, subscribe to it. That's how we know you want more.